Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover in this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're certainly films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema, of the fact it's really difficult to get films made, and I want to salute those who manage to do so. Without further ado, I'm going to just crack on there. As always, I'm going to play you a clip to start with, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
Nick Dunn, you're probably the most hated man in America right now. Did you kill your wife, Nick?
Everyone told us marriage is hard work. Not for me and Nick.
As you all know, my wife, Amy Elliott Dunn, disappeared 3 days ago. I had nothing to do with the disappearance of my wife. I have nothing to hide.
So Amy got friends we can talk to?
No, not really.
You don't know if she has friends, you don't know what she does all day, and you don't know your wife's blood type.
Just being a good guy, so everybody can see him being a good guy.
Well, you really don't like him, do you?
All I'm trying to do is be nice to the people who are volunteering to help find Amy.
See, I've been away on this podcast summer break and my abrupt editing skills are still absolutely top notch, I'm sure you'll agree. That is a clip from the trailer of 2014's Gone Girl, directed by David Fincher, screenplay by Gillian Flynn based on her book, and starring Ben Affleck, Rosamund Pike, Neil Patrick Harris, Tyler Perry and Carrie Coon are the main leads in this particular movie. And so the story of Gone Girl, well, a publishing sensation really, it goes back to the start of the 2010s. But even before we get to the book, let's just have a quick chat about Reese Witherspoon, the Oscar-winning actor, and moving at this stage in her career, she moved into producing as well, and she was a woman on a mission. Because fed up with the dearth of quality female leading roles in films and also an avid reader, she decided to make a firmer jump into film production. That she'd had a production company before, but that had been primarily to develop projects for her to star in. But this time she had a broader plan that she wanted now to develop projects for women to star in across film and television. And this led to the creation of a production company, Pacific Standard, that she set up in partnership with Bruna Papandera. Now, amongst the first two manuscripts that Pacific Standard took receipt of, one was Wild, the other was Gone Girl, and they happened to be the first two projects that this particular company optioned to press ahead to make into films. Now, in the case of Gone Girl, Papandera got wind of the book at the end of 2011 when it hadn't been published. It was still in manuscript form, but it's pretty well known around Hollywood that manuscripts do get passed around and early buzz on projects just bubbles up and bidding wars take place before a book has even made it to a bookstore. That was certainly what was going to happen here. But in the case of Witherspoon and Papandera, because they'd jumped in early, they were able to get their option in place. Now, Gone Girl was the work and is the work of author Gillian Flynn. This was her third novel off the top of my head, and the manuscript had been doing the rounds. Hollywood was interested, and when the book was published in 2012, it swiftly became Flynn's biggest hit to date. In fact, it became an absolute publishing sensation. But by that stage, the Hollywood deal making was already well underway, because now it was a case of, well, which movie studio wants to pick this project up? And Flynn was fielding calls from pretty much all of them. Now, she knew that her story had jagged edges to it, that it wasn't necessarily a particularly Hollywood story. Maybe in the 1980s and early 90s when R-rated thrillers were more of a thing. But this was going to be a slightly tougher sell going into the early 2010s, the mid 2010s. But also she was aware that she'd written, a 500-page book, and as an avid reader of film screenplays already, she knew that was going to have to come down by, roughly around 2/3 to make a film script. However, this was her chance, and as she told the Los Angeles Times, she said it was a big, dense book. She says, you think you can drop a certain scene, and then you realise 3 scenes later you've just missed an important setup. And she said, my big fear was having it turn into this kind of an engine and losing what I thought was special about it, the smaller nuances and the humour of it. And so with that in mind, she was determined to have a go at adapting this herself, and she certainly had the power and clout in her deal making to be able to do so. And so within 2 months of the book's debut, 20th Century Fox had optioned the book formally and was looking to back the project, with Witherspoon and her company producing. But written into Flynn's deal was that she would get to write her draft of the screenplay before anyone else was given an opportunity to do so. What she didn't want was a studio coming in, assigning a writer, and she was cut out of the process. She wanted at the very least to have first go at this, and Fox, very keen to secure the project, so gave it the nod. Now, she didn't go into this naively. She knew that adaptation was a tricky business, and so she did her research. As well as being the aforementioned avid reader of screenplays, she looked at how certain books had been adapted to the screen. She looked at Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley, how the film of that turned out, for instance. She also got in touch with Steve Kloves, who'd had the mammoth job at adapting the majority of the Harry Potter books to the big screen, and talked to him about how exactly do you go about doing this. And then to refresh her memory of the book that she'd written herself, she listened to the audiobook of Gone Girl. Now, she was doing the tour promoting the novel while all this was going on, but there came a point during her writing process where she stopped allowing herself to go back to her novel. She stopped listening to that audiobook, and she would write the script based on her recollection of it rather than slavishly devoting herself back to her original text. She duly did her drafts. The first draft, as she would tell Fast Company in an interview, was basically TV miniseries length, but she drew it down, and by December 2012, she got to a point where she could deliver a screenplay draft to 20th Century Fox. Now, separately, director David Fincher was circling at this stage in his career. He was coming off the back of relative success with his US remake of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I say relative success. It did well for an R-rated movie, but it also raised questions at that stage in the US about the box office potential of an R-rated movie. Those conversations were duly smashed a few years down the line by Deadpool coming along, but at that stage, it was still a thing. Now, Fincher was intrigued by the idea of turning Gone Girl into a film, and in early 2013, Gillian Flynn and David Fincher met up for the first time to talk about this. Now, Flynn, a movie nerd, wanted David Fincher to do it. Why wouldn't she? In 2010, he'd made one of his finest films, The Social Network. He's coming off things like Fight Club. David Fincher needs no introduction, short of the fact I will get to Zodiac on this podcast in due course. I think Zodiac is possibly his masterpiece, although there's some competition in there. But the bottom line for this story is Flynn wanted Fincher to do the film, but she didn't assume that he would want to do it. Now, on the other side of the table, Fincher was not really that keen with the idea of joining forces with a first-time screenwriter. However, as they conversed, it became clear that they saw the same things in the book, that they saw the things from the book that they wanted to make it into the movie. And they got on and they were getting somewhere. Now, they were both busy. Fincher at this stage was in the midst of the TV show House of Cards that was being made and developed for Netflix. He was developing material as well. And so Flynn would go away and write, and she would send material over to David Fincher. Fincher would then read it. They'd then have a phone chat, and Flynn would rework. And Flynn, she said she enjoyed the process. She certainly enjoyed this part of the process working with Fincher. She would describe him as, quote, a really good editor. Now, it became clear that David Fincher was going to direct this. He was putting the hours in. He would sign ultimately on the dotted line to do so. And that would have a knock-on effect where Reese Witherspoon was concerned. Effectively, as the originator of the movie project, she was looking to play the lead role of Amy in the film as well. But as she told The Hollywood Reporter a few years down the line, she said, I was always open to doing it, but whenever David Fincher says he wants to do a project, you just sit back and say, whatever you want to do. And Witherspoon said we had a long conversation where he was like, you're not right for it and this is why. And she would say, I actually completely agreed with him. So who was going to be right? I mean, there were two difficult roles to cast at the heart of this, Amy and her husband, Nick. And so casting-wise, I mean, Ben Affleck at this stage was on the verge of directing his latest movie, Live by Night. I mean, he picked up his latest Oscars for his film Argo at this stage and was planning to direct again. But Fincher had been exploring possible candidates to play the role of Nick. I mean, Affleck at this stage had been cast as Batman as well. So that was the direction his career was heading towards. But he saw in still images, facial mannerisms in Affleck that he just thought they'd just be right for this particular role. And so he got in touch, they had conversations, and Affleck in the end agreed to sign on the dotted line. He would delay directing Live by Night to be able to do Gone Girl. But Fincher would say in interviews, certainly promoting the film, that one of the reasons he was drawn to Affleck says he knows what it's like to be hunted. Affleck had been in the lens of the paparazzi, in the lens of tabloid press for a long time, and he knew part of that life, and he knew that that was where this character was going to go. Now, it's worth noting as well, and IndieWire reported on this, that Jon Hamm had been rumoured at one stage to be taking on the role of Nick. The New York Post also reported this, saying that he was up for the lead role, but he was in the midst of doing the TV show Mad Men at the time, and Matthew Weiner, the creator of Mad Men, was allegedly said to have blocked his chance to be able to take the lead in Gone Girl. That an anonymous source said Matt would not let John out of his contract to do it. John was really upset at the time and is still upset because he's thinking about the future of his career as Mad Men comes to a close. However, Hamm just pressed ahead with his Mad Men work. He's not done too shabbily when it comes to films either. And the path was clear for Affleck to take this one. But the role of Amy was equally crucial, and the several names were being bandied around: Emily Blunt, Charlize Theron, Natalie Portman, terrific actors, all among the candidates. But what Fincher was looking for was someone one of the qualities he was looking for was someone where you couldn't immediately age them. You couldn't necessarily say, I know how old that person is, that there was a degree of ambiguity to them. And so while Rosamund Pike, who'd broken through with the James Bond film Die Another Day many, many years before, wasn't the immediate choice for this one, at least certainly in the eyes of the Hollywood trade press, she was actually the one that Fincher was zeroing in on. Not that Rosamund Pike really knew this. Now, the first she knew was when she got a call saying David Fincher wants to meet you for a project, and so she took the call. I mean, why wouldn't you? She didn't know it was for Gone Girl at that point. In fact, she hadn't read the book at this stage when Fincher talked to her, and she didn't quite know what to make of it all. Then she realised what it was for. She was told what it was for, and so it started a series of conversations that took place over Skype over a short period of time. Now, it needed to be over Skype because Fincher was in America and Pike was in the middle of shooting a British film called What We Did on Our Holiday, which is sort of spun out of the TV series Outnumbered, and she was taking on a lead role with that, shooting it in Scotland, but not necessarily near where she could get a stable internet connection in the place where she was stopping. So what she had to do was join, apparently, and this came out in a Vanity Fair piece, a gym near the location in Scotland, just so she could get an internet connection, so she could toddle off there to go and talk to Fincher. And Fincher and Pike would converse as she made her way more and more through the book. They'd talk about how far she got through the book, what she was feeling, and it all led up to an invitation to go across to America, to St. Louis. Now, this was where Fincher was scouting locations for the film, and the pair met up, had a conversation, and it came out in W magazine that Pike, off the back of that meeting, went back to Scotland to finish making What We Did on Our Holiday, and she got a text message that the text message from Fincher said, "You have the part." Just ahead of her, Ben Affleck had been announced, and the news broke in July of 2013 that Rosamund Pike and Ben Affleck were going to star. At that stage, Neil Patrick Harris and Tyler Perry were also linked. Perry, in fact, would sign up with apparently his agent hiding information about the film and the director and the book from him, because otherwise it might spook him to the point of not taking the work on. Patrick Fugit, Carrie Coon and Kim Dickens were also confirmed in September. And on September September the 11th, 2013, some early filming work began ahead of the formal start of production on Gone Girl on September the 15th, 2013. Now, I've talked about one or two David Fincher movies on this podcast before, and I think most film nerds know that he's very, very precise in the way that he goes about making his movies. He has an ethos of, if you're going to get all the equipment and pay all that expense to get cameras out, to get people out, to get a load of production crew out, you may as well be filming as much as possible. You don't want people hanging around in trailers when you can have them on set, when you can be trying things. The bottom line is he does an awful lot of takes, He also likes things to be pretty exact, and he would run scenes on Gone Girl as he would on his previous films, time after time after time after time. He would shoot a lot of material, but also he would get a lot of material in the can in a given day, that he would get 4 or 5 hours a day of footage shot. And in fact, it was Carrie Coon who captured this talking to Collider, where she talked about his process. She said, what I discovered about David is he's a perfectionist and I'm a perfectionist. So if you want to do 70 takes, that's all the more time I have to practice and try to do better. She would say he would show me the frame and tell me why he was asking me to do the things he was asking for. And she argued you can't take it personally because he's looking at the whole picture. You know when he's focused on you, and so many other times he's not. And if you take that personally, you're going to get in your own way. And this was his process. In fact, there was a point where Rosamund Pike had to fly back to the UK just to do a couple of pickup shots for what we did on our holiday. And she told this to Kermit and Mayo's radio program, that she came and did those pickup shots. She just did a couple of takes and turned to the directors and just said, is that all you want? I'm working with David Fincher at the moment. Turned out that was all they wanted, and she flew back to the US to the days of doing 30, 40 takes of certain shots. Now, one of the most bizarre film stories that came up in the midst of shooting Gone Girl was over a cap. In particular, a cap that David Fincher wanted Ben Affleck to wear. That there was a spat of sorts between the pair, although I suspect this is one of those where it was heavily blown up by the media and there wasn't actually too much to it. But let's do some sports stuff. So Ben Affleck is a fan of the Boston Red Sox. David Fincher insisted that the character of Nick would wear a New York Yankees hat. Now, I am from the UK. I'm not familiar with how fervent the rivalry is between the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees, but let's just say Affleck told the New York Times, he said, David, I love you. I would do anything for you, but I will not wear a Yankees hat. I just can't. I can't wear it because it's going to become a thing. I will never hear the end of it. I can't do it. And Affleck refused to wear the cap. Now, if you believe the clickbait version of the story, this shut the film down for days. This was a disaster. This was a mass falling out. Actually, what happened was they had a chat. Affleck did say, I can't wear it. And he said that they had a conversation between them, and the compromise was that Affleck would wear a New York Mets cap instead. So there you go. That's slightly less clickbaity, but a little bit close to the truth of what actually happened, and that's the cap you see him wearing in the movie. Production would carry on. I mean, it's very efficient, a very efficient filming, even though it was doing up to about 50 takes per scene in the vast majority of cases. But Fincher was working on about a 100-day production schedule. He was working to a $60 million budget. So as he said in the past, it's just like he'd rather not spend the money on helicopters. He'd rather spend the money on shooting footage, and that's what he was doing. So it's relatively modestly costed film, given the high profile of the talent involved. In fact, the high profile of the project itself. By the turn of 2014, filming had wrapped up with somewhat 400 or 500 hours for Fincher and his team to wade through. We knew by this stage as well that Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, who'd done such staggering work on the music for films like The Social Network, were coming back and reuniting with Fincher for this one. In fact, Reznor would note in an interview that the film was already a lot darker than he was expecting and a bit nasty, and he was expecting dark and nasty, but not quite this dark and nasty. Now, there was a pre-existing fan base for Gone Girl, that the book itself had sold tens of millions of copies, and as such, fans of the book were protective of where the film was going. So it didn't necessarily help, or did it, depending on your viewpoint, that in an interview in January 2014, David Fincher told Entertainment Weekly magazine that Flynn had scrapped the original ending of the book and, quote, started from scratch. Now, Flynn would go online and dial back from that in a further interview, but as an Entertainment Weekly piece close to the release of the film noted, this since he'd said that, he's had to contend with fan outrage over that comment. Now, Fincher said that Entertainment Weekly took his quote out of context. The magazine disagreed, but they had a conversation. What exactly had changed? And as Fincher told the outlet, everything and nothing. Which wasn't particularly helpful. He said, you're not changing the marrow of the creature, you're just changing the bone structure and the muscles and the skin and the hair. He said it's all of its outer sheathing, but at its core, it's exactly what I think Gillian always intended. So, as you can imagine, that did absolutely zero to quash rumours that the ending had been dramatically changed. And in fact, it may as well have just gone to the local fuel station, got a couple of gallons of unleaded and just poured that on the particular flame. The interest in the film bubbled. I mean, the first trailer for it was hugely anticipated and widely watched as well. And Fox, with some confidence, was building towards a release date for this one in October 2014 in the US, premiering the movie at the New York Film Festival on September the 26th, 2014. The promotion in tandem with all of this was building up, and as soon as a set picture appeared online, it was devoured. As soon as any little tidbit about the production came about, it was also devoured. And then, of course, the first trailer for the movie landed. Now, this went online in April of 2014. In fact, I'm reading the Guardian article on it now. It's like, Gone Girl's trailer is out, but is Fincher on form? And there was thinking, is this going to be a grown-up thriller? Is this the kind of thriller that Hollywood had, but almost forgotten how to make, really, outside of things like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo? The first trailer that came out stripped right back on dialogue as well, played heavily on the imagery, and the response to it was strong. It certainly did nothing to douse any kind of enthusiasm in the movie, and so it was full steam ahead, really, for the release of the film. So there were a couple of reasons this was highly anticipated, of course, one of which was it was Gone Girl. It was based on this hugely loved book, this hugely successful book. Also, it was a new David Fincher film. And little did we know at that stage, it was going to be the last David Fincher film for over half a decade as well. And so when it got in front of critics, I mean, generally they were very strong. I mean, in particular, Rosamund Pike's performance was given a very, very strong thumbs up. Ben Affleck came out of it well as well. I mean, whilst he was shooting Gone Girl, he was in the midst of working around the world of Batman as well. He was juggling an awful lot in his personal life, which I'm not going to go into now. And this was a 2.5 hour thriller that had no plans whatsoever to tailor itself to a PG-13 family-friendly audience. And the feeling was that as much as it had cut out certain elements of the book and certain characters of the book, that I because Flynn had made those decisions herself, that it wasn't foisted on her by screenwriters coming in and changing her work, I think that certainly helped. But also it was felt that they got to the core of the text, that it was working, that it was a different beast from the book, but also a familiar enough one to just about get away with pleasing the vast majority of people. In fact, a large swathe of high-profile critics as well would put it in their top 10 lists for the end of the year. They wouldn't necessarily put it in first place, but it was certainly in and around there. But the question mark remained, would the audience turn out to watch it? I mean, there was still an element of gamble to this, and so it went into US cinemas in October of 2014, and the response to it, well, it was strong. Much to the relief of executives at Fox, it opened in first place with a 37.5 million opening weekend, the weekend of October the 3rd to the 5th. This was a great result. I mean, no two ways about it, not least because there was strong competition that weekend as well with the opening of the horror spin-off movie Annabelle, which also opened with $37 million. Gone Girl just edged that out into first place. But the competition around wasn't bad either. We weren't quite at the stage where October had become an annex of prime blockbuster release time, although Guardians of the Galaxy's presence in the top 10, and that was one of the transformative films into making late summer blockbuster territory. The fact that Guardians of the Galaxy was there was just an indicator of what was to come. But still, Denzel Washington in The Equalizer was in third place, the previous week's number one, and helped itself to 18.7 million in its second weekend as well. Leica's lovely, wonderful The Box Trolls was in the top 10. again, the first Maze Runner movie was in there, and that was doing well too. This Is Where I Leave You, Dolphin Tale 2, and No Good Deed were the films that rounded out the top 10 as well. And Gone Girl also held its audience for its second week too. That there's a school of thought that big films, certainly big hyped films without an awful lot of substance behind them, sometimes with substance behind them, will lose 50, 60, 70% of their weekend gross going into their second weekend. In the case of Gone Girl, it lost 30%. It held number one spot for a second week with 26 million in the bank, holding off the likes of Dracula Untold. And in fact, it was the film Fury, quite an underrated film, that one, I think, starring Brad Pitt, directed by David Ayers, which knocked it off the top spot the week after, and with a 23 million gross. Gone Girl was still making 17 million by its third weekend, and in fact, by the time it left US cinemas, it was a really sizable hit, $167 million at the US box office, and it was also a hit that travelled overseas as well, 201 million outside of the US for a worldwide gross of 369 million. No wonder Gillian Flynn was being asked about a sequel to the film, and she didn't play that down either. She said she would certainly be interested in revisiting the characters at some point, telling the New York Daily News. She said there could be a sequel at some point if everyone's game to get the gang back together. It could be really fun a few years from now to pick it up and see what those crazy duns are up to a few years down the road, and if they got on. Well, not well, I don't think. But she said, I would have to have exactly the same people back to do it. She would want Rosamund Pike, Ben Affleck, David Fincher, and they basically haven't come back to do it. I don't think that's a massive spoiler to tell you that. Flynn and Fincher would look to work together again, though, that they would quickly sign up to work on the US remake of the British TV success Utopia. By the time that ultimately made it to screens, Fincher had long dropped away from that, but Flynn stayed with that right the way through to its release. And it's also worth noting that Gone Girl interested the Academy Awards as well, though perhaps not to the degree that some were expecting. Nonetheless, for the 87th Academy Awards, Rosamund Pike was nominated for Best Actress. She didn't win, as it happened. But the prize that year went to Julianne Moore in the film Still Alice. But Gone Girl, surprisingly, was shut out of every other category, and this was at a point where the Academy had opened up the Best Picture race to lots and lots of films rather than just 5. It's a reasonably strong film, but it was perhaps a surprise that Gone Girl didn't make more of an appearance. But still, for Reese Witherspoon, I mean, there would be some compensation by the fact that the other project she'd optioned at the same time, That Would Be Wild, that had turned up at the Oscars as well. In fact, Reese Witherspoon would also get a Best Actress Oscar nomination that year for playing the lead in Wild, and Laura Dern would get a Best Supporting Actress nod as well. That took 2 nominations to Gone Girl's 1, but both films were successes, and in fact Witherspoon went on to sell her company and start a much bigger venture called Hello Sunshine that she's working on to this day, and she continues to develop projects for women to star in that are enjoying a lot of mainstream success as well. In the case of Gone Girl, I mean, the aftermath for David Fincher would be a long time before he would get a film, as I said, off the ground again, and that's the shame, really, that I'm a big fan of Gone Girl. I think it's a film that very much rewards repeated viewing, and it wouldn't be until Netflix came along with its checkbook that Fincher would be tempted away from the television projects he'd been working on, House of Cards, Mindhunter, and go back to directing for a film with the movie Mank that was written by his late father. He's got more projects on the stove at the moment, and if all goes to plan, if I'm still here in many years' time, we'll talk about those in future episodes of Film Stories. I'm just going to do my parish notices and pleas and requests and nice things. So first and foremost, if you like this podcast, there are 3 ways to support it. I'm so grateful to those of you who do so. It is hugely appreciated. I'm grateful for you listening, to be fair. So, everyone's a winner, right? But if you want to financially support what I'm trying to do with Film Stories, which includes giving lots of writers their first paid writing work as well, which includes investing in materials for this podcast, which doesn't cover the coffee bill, sadly, but that's quite expensive. You can find you can find me on Patreon, patreon.com/SimonBrew. And if you back me financially there and back this podcast and the website financially there, you get the podcast early. In this particular case, you'd have got this episode very early. I think you'll also find out the gossip of what we're up to and behind the scenes stuff on Film Stories as well. If you can subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice, my podcast host is changing, so hopefully it all still works, then that's hugely appreciated as well. And likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that makes a difference. That really helps with algorithms and posh things that I don't really understand. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you as always for listening, and thank you for your time. If I don't bore you completely here, you can find more on me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories. You can find more on that at the Film Stories website, which is filmstories.co.uk. That website also has movie news, reviews, features, all sorts of things that we do there. Store.filmstories.co.uk is where you can buy back issues of all of our magazines and our Sneakers Blu-ray, which we added fresh extras to as well. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, youtube.com/filmstories, and the Patreon is patreon.com/simonbrew. But without further ado, I'm going to go off and watch another bunch of films. The most important thing, as always, is you stay safe and you stay well. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all look after yourselves. Good to be back. Take care. Bye-bye.